Okay, let's get started. Second reminder, this evening we have a world-renowned lecturer coming, Tan Lee. She's the CEO of Emotive Corporation. We're going to talk about Tan Lee and her company, and specifically the device she makes right at the end of the course when we start to talk about brain-computer interaction. Remember, we have humans and machines interacting with one another. The output from one becomes the input to the other and vice versa. For us, output is usually action, and input is something arriving at our sensory systems. What happens if you jump over action and sensation altogether, and you talk, quote unquote, to a device directly through thought, and it talks back to you directly to the brain, skipping over our muscle system and our sensory systems. Kind of an interesting idea. It is the bleeding edge in HCI at the moment, BCI, brain-computer interaction, and Tan and her company are definitely leading the way. So by all means, if you can make it, I highly recommend it. As additional incentive, as I mentioned on Tuesday, if you do come to the lecture, there's going to be about a 15-minute question and answer period at the end, which I will be moderating. At the end of that, if you're at the talk, come up and see me, and there'll be another sign-up sheet. If you sign your name that you came to the talk, an extra 3% will be distributed across your final grade. So please do come, should be fascinating. Okay, so where are we and where are we going? We're making our way through this second to last theme of the course, looking outward. And we've been looking at ubiquitous technology so far, so technology that we're stitching into the world. All of that technology that we've been considering so far, the technology itself is stationary. It's able to sense the world and influence indirectly human behavior, but not directly. We're going to switch over today when we finish lecture 19 and start in on a 5-part lecture series on robotics, which is the final class of human-computer interaction technology we're going to be looking at. Why are we talking about robotics in an HCI class? One of the reasons is because that's what I do research in, and I think robots are super cool. It's a good reason. The other reason is obviously if you start to think about our forms of interactions with a machine which itself can push against the world and observe how the world pushes back, we get some very interesting kinds of interactions that are possible between humans and this particular class of machines. Okay, we will finish lecture 19 today on the Human Speech-Own project, and then we'll spend the rest of today sort of talking about what robots are. It's a vast topic, and we're going to focus in on that particular aspect of robotics that concerns us as students of HCI. Okay, but before we do, today is the day when we assign the 10th and final deliverable that you never thought you'd get here, right? Time flies. Last one. Okay, let's talk about deliverable 10. It is not too different from what you've been doing so far. You're going to be adding 3 different visualizations in deliverable 10 that are described in step 1, 3, and 5 here. These visualizations are going to integrate with the database that you've been developing, right? As different users log into your system and they start to interact with your system, you're recording data about their interactions, and you're going to take all of that data and transform it into a visualization. The first visualization that you're going to show is show the user a visualization about how their performance during their current session differs from their performance during the last session with the system, right? So again, just further proof that you're tracking the user over time. You're now midway through turning your code into a piece of educational software. What's one of the most important things that a user of a piece of educational software is going to want to know is, are they making progress? Are they learning, right? So as you think about creating this visualization, as always in HCI, there's lots of things you could do in MPL toolkits or Matplotlib or Pygame, which some of you have switched over to. There's lots of bells and whistles you could build into the visualization. What we're looking for here is that you thought carefully about the visualization and how it should support the user. You want to minimize or maximize the data to ink ratio. You want to try and give the user as much information as you can about how or whether they're learning with as little distraction as possible. right? You now have probably quite a few things going on your screen. You want to make sure you don't distract the user, right? They may be looking at the wireframe of the hand, and they may be actually looking down at their own hand, back up at the wireframe, trying to figure out, are they signing correctly or not? And then something flashes off over here, and they look and their hand wanders off the center of the field of view of lead motion, and they have to start all over again, right? So now you're going to hopefully bring a lot of the things we've talked about in terms of visual design and pact analysis to bear when you create these visualizations. Okay, that's the first one. Second one is assuming that your database has recorded information about two or more users. How is my performance comparing against other users in the system? Is it a competitive environment? Is it a collaborative environment? Again, it's up to you. One of the ways to incentivize someone to learn is to see that they're making progress and catching up or doing as well, or if not better, than others that have used the system. So how am I doing compared to everyone else who's used it so far? That's the second visualization. The third one is the most challenging. You're going to be creating a real-time warmer or colder visualization, right? So you know with KNN that it takes a little while for it to actually recognize whether you're signing correctly or not. What we want to try and train our users to do is see what they're supposed to do, such as sign the digit 3, sign the digit 3, and then hold it steady long enough for the system to recognize, are they signing it correctly or not, right? If they're signing it correctly, we want to try and give some signal that they're getting warmer. So you're doing the right thing, hold still, don't change, let the KNN do what it's supposed to do, and then you flash up, you signed correctly or you didn't. It's up to you how you want to create this warmer or colder visualization. So colder in the sense of whatever it is you're doing is not the correct sign, you might want to change it. Question?
You have to tell them how to change it?
Ah, good question. Do you have to tell them how to change it? That's up to you. Think about what the user is trying to do. In the previous deliverable, you were working on scaffolding, right? I would suggest if it's a novice user, and you can use the data that you're collecting in the database to determine whether this is a novice user, then yes, then you probably would tell them what to do if they're getting colder. Later users, probably not. Right? Again, it's up to you. So you might want to combine some of these visualizations with the scaffolding that you developed in the previous deliverable. Any other questions about deliverable 10? All good? Okay, so as promised, next week, next Thursday, after you've submitted deliverable 10, we'll talk next Thursday about what you'll be doing between next week and the final exam period. Any other questions about the deliverables? One other thing, hopefully none of you are still struggling with installation and LEAP library issues. If you are, a couple students have found that creating a virtual environment is a good way to go. There are virtual environments for Mac, Linux, and Windows. If you Google virtual environments for your platform, you usually find a way to set them up. The nice thing about a virtual environment, as the name implies, is that it creates a subset inside your computer, an environment which is virtual. It's independent of everything else you've installed on your computer, and you can install things fresh inside the virtual environment. Pip, Python, then all the Python libraries, and off you go. So if you're still having issues, consider virtual environments. Okay, so back to the lecture material. Lecture 19, we were talking about the extremely interesting but also extremely controversial Human Speechome project, which is the third and final section here in thinking about if we stitch technology into the world around us, how does that enable us to investigate human behavior in ways that would have been difficult or impossible before. One really difficult aspect of human behavior to study is how do children acquire language? Professor Roy came up with this approach, brute force approach, which is just record everything. This is the biggest home diary, home journal in the world. And they're looking at these questions about how do children learn language? What about their physical environment influences the acquisition of learning? And what events in the past influence that learning? We ended last time by just sort of touching on some of the hardware, the cameras and microphones, the total amount of data that was collected, which was which was daunting even by today's standards. And then around that hardware and data, they developed a bunch of HCI interfaces, which were designed to allow Professor Roy's army of graduate students to sift through this massive amount of video and audio and pick out salient or important features, right? In the audio, important features are clearly going to be words themselves. What are some other salient features that you might want to go looking for in the audio data that's relevant for language acquisition?
Background noise, like with water, if you hear water in the background.
Absolutely. So in the TED Talk, if you go back and hear the child acquiring the word water, you actually hear water in the background several times. We're going to focus just on this lecture in just the words that were spoken by either the child or the three caregivers, the mother, the father, and the nanny. But you could imagine diving back into the data and looking for evidence for or against additional hypotheses, such as the fact of being near water while it's running helps you acquire the word water. You might remember when we were talking about visual design, one of the nice things about creating graphical interfaces is they're interactive, right? We can visualize some of the data, which might suggest new hypotheses, in this case about language acquisition. We can then go diving back into the data and visualize different parts of it in different ways to try and confirm or deny those hypotheses. If you have a static image in a textbook, it's very hard to do that sort of interactive hypothesis formulation and testing. Okay, so let's now switch from the hardware and the data to testing some of these hypotheses. Because they were recording basically everything in the home for the first 3 years, or at least the first 9 to 24 months of age of the child, there were patterns that they could start to see that no one who had studied language acquisition before had ever seen. What is this graph telling us?
Language acquisition grows at an exponential rate up to the age of 20 months.
Absolutely. So that was known before. If you've ever been around a child who's between 16 and 24 months of age, it's incredible. They're like a sponge. They absorb and start using words at an incredible rate. That's been known, that rate is incredible, and that rate itself increases over time. So it was known before this experiment that there is an exponential increase in language acquisition, but clearly it can't go on forever because the number of words in the English language is finite. But it's amazing how sudden this happens, at least for this particular child. What happened at 20 months of age? It drops off really suddenly. Why? So now we're going from observing the data to formulating a hypothesis for why that might have happened.
Did they know enough words to kind of talk without learning a word every second?
Possibly. Other ideas?
You can start combining words.
You can start combining words, right? One of the beautiful things about language is compositionality, right? Once you have a base set of words and there's some complex idea you're trying to get across, you can combine words. Perhaps that's what started to happen around 20 months of age. Other ideas? This is one of the fun things about this experiment is, again, nobody knows, right? We can formulate new hypotheses, and we could then go back in the data and start to test that. Was the child using combinations of words much more often at 20 months and older or not? Can we find evidence in this original data set to confirm or deny that hypothesis? Interesting to think about. If we were to do this with another child, would we get the same curve? Or is this just an artifact of this particular child? We can ask other questions. Here's another hypothesis. Perhaps the thing that influences word birth, and word birth is just shorthand for the first time that the child uttered the adult form of a word, is word birth influenced by how often the child heard that word before they mentioned it? So that's the hypothesis. Here's the data that seems to support that. So on the horizontal axis, again, we have the age of the child in months. And each dot here corresponds to a particular word. And so the horizontal position of that dot represents the point in time at which the child uttered that word, the adult form of that word, for the first time. And the height of the word represents the amount of times that that word was uttered by the other three caregivers up to and including the month in which the child said that word. That's the data. You'll notice that, generally speaking, there are more dots up and to the left and more dots down and to the right. What can you tell me about these dots down here?
The child picked them up really quick and heard them a lot.
Didn't pick them up very quickly.
Well, that they weren't uttered a lot.
They weren't uttered a lot, that's right. They're low, and they were picked up late relative to the other dots. So dots that are over to the right, these were words that were spoken for the first time by the child later in this language acquisition period. The leftmost dot here is the word that was picked up, that was the word that was said first by the child. Right? Okay, so as you would expect, or maybe as you would expect, words that weren't heard very often, words that are low in this plot, were first uttered by the child later, further to the right in this plot. How do we know that that's generally the case? They used a linear regression here. They took a straight line, and they tried to fit that straight line so that straight line was as close to all the dots as possible. Clearly, these dots do not all lie along a straight line. There's quite a bit of spread, so we can't trust this model too much. So again, we're dealing with humans. Humans are complicated. There's probably not one clean, simple hypothesis that's going to explain language acquisition. But from this plot, frequency probably has something to do with the rate of acquisition, or the time of acquisition. Maybe not that unexpected. Okay. What else might be influencing language acquisition other than the frequency at which it was heard by the child? There's many other things we could consider. In the plot on the right, they're going to also consider prosody, which we've seen before. Prosody is the way in which the word was said. So we can say words quicker, slower, at a higher volume, at a lower volume, or we can say it in what's known in developmental psychology as motherese, or baby talk, where the caregivers tend to exaggerate the vowels. And the more they exaggerate the vowels, the further that word is away from the normal adult form of that word. So that's the feature, the prosodic feature we're going to look at in this particular data set. Again, there's other forms like volume and frequency we could look at, volume and pitch. We're not going to look at those. We're just going to look at the amount of motherese in the words uttered by the three caregivers. That's P. P of 0 means that word was spoken in the adult form. A much larger P represents that the vowels were exaggerated much more. So far, so good? So we now have F and P. So we can take a given word, any one of the dots that you see here, and we can measure F and P for that word. F, how many times was that word spoken by the caregivers before the child said that word? And if we go back and look at all the utterances of that word by the three caregivers, how much motherese was in those utterances? Okay. So we're now going to try and combine them. So we're going to ask the hypothesis of, is it a combination of frequency and prosody that influences how early or how late a word is spoken? And we're going to do that by creating a relatively simple equation here. It's simply a weighted sum. And we're then going to tune the weights of these two terms using alpha. So I don't have it written here, but what we should actually have here is alpha times F plus 1 minus alpha P. So you can think of alpha as a slider bar. When alpha is at 0, we're measuring the correlation between just F and just F and age, the age at which the child first spoke the word. And that represents this picture right here. Right? The correlation between F on the vertical axis and age on the horizontal axis. We fit this with the linear regression line, and the linear regression line gives us back a value of minus 0.29. There's a slight anti-correlation between F and A. The bigger F, the smaller A. The smaller F, the bigger A. That's the anti-correlation, the negative number, right? But that correlation, or that anti-correlation, is for just this combination of F and P. What about the correlation between this combination or this combination? So in this axis here, or this plot here, what we're looking at is we're going to gradually move the slider bar of alpha from 0 all the way to 1. And as we're moving the slider bar, we're altering the weight between F and P. When we have an alpha of 0.5, which is right here, we're asking, is language acquisition correlated with an even combination of F and P? So we compute this value, which we know for all the dots, which would create a different picture of this. And we have and that'll give us back a separate correlation value, which in this case is about minus 0.24, slightly less correlation if we mix them. If we move the slider bar all the way to the right, we get this equation, and if we then look at the correlation between this and A, we're asking, does motherese predict, just motherese, P, prosody, does just prosody predict the time at which words are acquired? So far, so good? Okay. So now, if you look at the right-hand graph, we can see again, we're moving the slider bar, and at each setting of the slider bar, we're asking, is there a correlation between these two things, and how strong is that correlation? Which gives us the check mark picture you get on the right. What does that tell you about language acquisition for this child?
The higher the prosody, the more likely the child is to pick it up.
The higher the prosody, the earlier it is to pick up language. Not quite. It's a little more complicated than that.
We're measuring negative correlation, so the lower we are on the chart, the higher the correlation is. Rather.
It's the stronger the correlation is, right? So the vertical axis in the right-hand picture is negative, right? So if that line, which it doesn't, ever approached 0 on the vertical axis, that would mean there's the strength of correlation is 0. F and P do not predict the age at which the word is acquired.
So the correlation relies more heavily on frequency than prosody.
The correlation relies more heavily on F than prosody. That's correct. But it does not rely on F alone, right? If the strongest correlation, which in this case would have been the most negative correlation here, that would have occurred here. This is for alpha of 0, that's this picture over here. That's testing whether just F predicts language acquisition, which is not the case, right? The lowest point occurs around here, which has a very strong, well, not very strong, but the strongest anti-correlation we have in this plot. And it's at this point of alpha 0.2, which means 0.8 F and 0.2 P tends to be most predictive of word acquisition. Kind of interesting. We're getting very, very specific now, and they're going far beyond what's possible in a laboratory setting because we have all this data. We can start to be very quantitative about what we think is influencing the learning of words by children, right? For this particular child, it was about 80% frequency. Frequency matters a lot, but doesn't explain everything, and motherese also helps. Elongating vowels help the child acquire the adult form of the word. Kind of interesting. Right? We could imagine other features other than F and P. For example, which of the 3 caregivers uttered the word? Did that have more of an influence on the uptake of the word? There's all sorts of things we could test in this data set. This is just sort of giving you an idea of the kinds of things you can do once you have data coming back from this form of ubiquitous technology. Okay, interesting, but to me the most interesting one is this plot, which Professor Roy mentioned briefly in his TED Talk. I'm going to dive down into it in a little more detail because it's really fascinating. This had never been seen before this particular experiment. It takes a little while to be able to parse this picture, so let's work our way through it. Again, we took every word that the child uttered between 9 and 24 months of age, and we asked when in time, when during that period, did they utter that word for the first time? And we then marched backwards in time, and we looked for every utterance of that word by the three caregivers. And when we found one of the three caregivers uttering that word earlier in time, we looked to see what was the mean length of the utterance that that word was embedded in. So if the word, for example, was water, and the child mentioned word water at 17 months, for example, we marched backwards looking for the word water, and let's say we found it 10 months earlier, uttered by the nanny, and the nanny said, want water. That's two words together, an utterance, not quite a sentence. We're going to count it as an utterance, and the length of that utterance is 2. There were 2 words. If instead we marched backwards in time, and now we heard the mother say, do you want water? That utterance would have a length of 4, right? And if we took water and went backwards in time, we'd find many of these utterances, and we'd measure the length of all of these utterances and take the mean of them and plot it on the vertical axis. So far, so good? All right, let's stick with our example of water. We would also march forward in time. So after the child had uttered the word water for the first time, we're going to march forward in time and find all of the utterances of the 3 caregivers and the mean length of the utterances that contain the word water. Right? And that'll give us a bunch of dots along the horizontal axis here in time, where 0 on the horizontal axis is when the child said it for the first time. That's just for water. We do the same thing for every other word, which would give us a whole bunch of curves. We take all of those curves and we line them up, align them horizontally. So if water occurred at 17 months and mother occurred at 10 months, we take both of them and line them up so that all of the words are all lined up now at 0 months from word birth. Right? So for all the words, they're lined up at 0, which is the month in which they were uttered. We're just kind of lining things up. And then we take all of those dots and we average them going backwards in time and forward in time. Make sense? Question?
How are there negative length of utterances?
How are there negative? That is a very good. Sorry. It's the change in MLU that we're looking at here, not MLU. So a change of negative means it's shorter than average for that word. Good question. So let's go back to water. Okay, we take every single utterance of the word water, and we take all of the sentences or the utterances in which the word water fell. We take the average, and sometimes it's below or above that average. So whatever the average length of the utterance was for utterances that contained water, at 0 or I guess 1 month here, those utterances that contained water were shorter, smaller on average than all the rest. Make sense? Okay. What's happening?
It seems like the utterance or the words getting more simple provided by the caregivers closer to the time when the child's actually recognizing the word. So they're adjusting to the child's feedback.
They're adjusting to the child's feedback, maybe, right? We don't know that. Now we're in hypothesis land. We're going to just stay in data analysis land, right? All we know from this picture is that the average change in MLU is decreasing towards 0, the time at which the word was born in the mouth of the child.
The caregivers are giving less context when using the word because since they can use the word on their own at the word birth, I think caregivers believe they understand the word in more context, so they don't actually have to provide longer sentences.
Possibly. So the hypothesis is the caregivers are providing less context when they're giving these shorter utterances. What do you mean by context here?
They have an understanding of what water is now, not just a collection of sounds, so they don't have to have long sentences that might explain what water is.
Possibly. So that's a hypothesis. So if the fire alarm went off and we were all wondering whether it was a false alarm or not, I might look at the door and say door, and hopefully that would be enough to say, I think this is probably something we should leave the room for, right? Perhaps if we were less familiar with this whole setting, I might say, I think that's a real fire alarm. We should all probably go to the door. Maybe. It's an interesting hypothesis. Maybe as the caregivers assume that the child understands, quote unquote, what's going on, they don't need to give as much context, and they just say water, which is shorthand for, do you want some water? Perhaps, perhaps.
Maybe once they like, so like the sometimes the kid would repeat, like in the recordings we saw the kid would repeat back to them the word that he recognized. So maybe when they heard him repeating it back to them, they would just like do the call and response like water, and then have the kid repeat it back and then say water again. Like,
Possibly, if the child is using the adult form of water. Possibly. That might be what's going on down here. You can imagine call and response, water, 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 water occurring down here. But that doesn't explain the fact that it's longer back here and longer after the fact.
Could it be that like way before they just don't expect to understand that at all? So they're not really going to try and be teaching it, and then afterwards they assume that it's understood, so they can try and use it to build further understanding by like making longer sentences.
Possibly, right? So it's amazing if you go back 15 months, over a year before the child ever utters the adult form of that word, they're using that word around the child in very long utterances. Perhaps the parents have a mental model of the child and predict using that mental model that it's way too early. We'll just talk normally. And then once we start to see signals from the child that they're starting to acquire words, maybe we'll start to shorten our utterances to help the child acquire it. What does that phenomenon remind you of? Shortening the utterances because you think the child is getting ready to say the word for the first time, and then gradually the utterances are getting longer and longer again. That's there's scaffolding, right? Without the hypothesis that scaffolding exists, right? So there's clear evidence that the parents are scaffolding the children. How they know to do it so well, hard to say. Margaret.
And also so, well, I don't really understand why it is. So, like, we go back and that's I don't know why I'm using longer utterances, but at least later, it would be that the child understands more and they can pronounce, a lot because, like with maybe they might understand a lot we're saying, but they can't pronounce.
Possibly. So maybe, again, the parents know that and just use longer utterances. It's a relatively smooth curve. We're averaging over a lot of data, and it seems to swoop down, and as Professor Roy said in the TED Talk, the parents meet the child right at the low part of that curve and then bring them back up again. Do you think the three caregivers sat down and made a huge spreadsheet of all the hundreds of words that they were going to try and teach the child and said, well, I think we're about 14 months out from water, so let's, probably not, right? So Deborah said probably a lot of what was going on in the home during this period is subconscious, right? But this probably wasn't, it'd be a pretty difficult thing to do consciously, right? So in some ways, again, as he mentioned in the TED Talk, it's not so much the parents teaching the children, it's the children teaching the parents. Here's what I can handle right now, or here's what I need right now to prepare for what I'm going to do 15 months from now, or 12 months from now, or 6 months from now. Kind of interesting. Huh? Okay. Possibly. We spent a lot of time in this course talking about physical context, social context. I want you to think now about the situation in that home between 9 and 24 months of age for the child. There are the three caregivers there and the child. Are there other factors that may be influencing this curve that don't really have to do with language acquisition? Remember your packed analysis.
I'd say if the caregivers or the two caregivers, the parents in this situation, got in like a long fight, then they might have a lower length of utterance than just being mad at each other and not really responding.
Possibly. I don't know. I wasn't there. Maybe it's in the data, maybe it's not. But again, there was a lot of other things going on in the home other than trying to help the child acquire language, right? This was their first child. I would assume at the outset of their first child, this was a learning process for them. Maybe they were talking amongst themselves a lot about what was going on and how to go about raising a child and all sorts of other things. Who knows? And maybe later in time, they're a little bit more comfortable with being parents and they're figuring out what to say under what conditions and so on. Who knows? There may be other confounding factors in this data set other than the fact of the child teaching the parent what it needs at a certain given time, right? So this comes up in any big data project or collecting massive amounts of data. They're trying to filter this data as best they can using these tools, but some of what they might capture might still be these confounding factors. When an utterance with the word water was captured, was it actually a caregiver talking to the child? It might have been two caregivers in another room talking amongst themselves, and they happen to mention the word water. Who knows? Okay, just something interesting to think about. This was one of the first studies of this form. There are more and more of them that are arriving in the scientific literature now that it's getting easier to instrument society with ubiquitous technology. Okay, any other questions about this before we switch gears and move on to robotics? Okay. Okay, so as promised, we are now going to look at the final class of technology, actually, sorry, the second last class of technology. We're going to look at brain-computer interfaces towards the end of the course. We're going to look at robotics now. And robots are interesting because they are definitely a piece of technology. Here's my little cartoon of a robot that we're looking at from above, and it's got two wheels here. There's a flashlight, and we see the robot turning and driving towards the flashlight. The robot or the piece of technology is interacting with the environment. Its output, its movement, changes its relationship with the flashlight. It gets a little bit closer. And now when it senses the light coming from the flashlight, the light values are different than a moment before, right? So its output influences its input at the next time step. This robot, like us, pushes against the world and observes, using its sensors, how the world pushes back. Right? So we have this feedback loop that is also embedded in our feedback loop of observing the technology itself, or maybe interacting with the robot. So the robot moves, and we see it move. So its output also becomes our input. And not in this cartoon, but we could imagine the person actively holding the flashlight, in which case the person's output becomes the input to the robot. So most of the technology we've been thinking about so far, like laptops and phones and embedded devices, they don't move themselves. They may be moved as the person carrying them moves, but they have no ability, or they have limited ability to move or push against the world and observe how the world pushes back. That's why we're talking about robots in an HCI course. This cartoon, or the kinds of interactions that can occur between humans and robots are different than the kinds of interactions that can occur between humans and smartphones or humans and embedded devices. Okay, so as this person is observing this robot, or in the little cartoon down here, we have someone who's also observing an animal. We build up a mental model of what the animal, in this case, is doing, right? Remember, we talked about mental models. You play with your phone, you build up an understanding of a basic understanding of what's going on inside the phone. You observe an animal or another human being, and you build up a mental model of what's going on inside that animal or that other human being. One of the problems, one of the bugs with mental model formation for humans is we often attribute more complexity than is actually there. That's what this little cartoon is meant to show. This little boy here is building up this mental model of the ant. And this young roboticist says, I got an idea about what's going on inside the ant. So I'm going to build an ant robot that scurries around like an ant does. They build the robot, and they build into the robot their mental model of what they think is going on inside the ant. We don't really know, down to a very fine level of detail, what's going on inside the ant, or a given organism or another human being. We build up a mental model somehow and then try and build that into a robot. We don't have time in this course to go into it, but the history of robotics, which goes all the way back to the Second World War, same time period as the beginning of computers, the period since then has been littered with abject failures in robotics because we often have the wrong mental models of things that can exhibit intelligent behavior. And and we build overly complex devices because of our overly complex mental models, and those devices don't work. There was a change in the history of robotics about 20 years ago to say, let's scale back and let's try and alter our mental model. What is the simplest mental model we can come up with to explain some animal or human behavior, and take that simple model and build it into a robot? And that seems to be much more successful so far than the other approach. Okay, so we've got robots here. We also are revisiting this concept of building up mental models. Okay. One of the first attempts to demonstrate that we have these wrong mental models was Valentino Breitenberg. Valentino Breitenberg was a neurophysiologist back in the 1970s and 80s, and he studied fruit flies. If you've ever spent any time in student housing, you've probably seen lots of fruit flies. They're extremely small. If there's any rotting fruit nearby, again, student housing, you've probably experienced this. But fruit flies will, even if they're far from the fruit, if there was a piece of rotting fruit in the back corner of the room and I was to release the fruit fly, it would gradually fly, find the rotten fruit, and have a buffet. The question back in the 70s and 80s, and I guess still to this day, is sort of how do animals do this? There were a lot of theories in the literature at that time that fruit flies were performing differential calculus and altering their approach vector based on that information. Professor Breitenberg actually studied the brains of fruit flies. You probably know how small a fruit fly is. Imagine how small the brain of a fruit fly is. He said there's no way that these things are doing differential calculus. They have to be doing something else. He published a bunch of papers on that, and then also wrote this really interesting book called Vehicles in the 1980s. If you're interested in this topic, I highly recommend this book. It's very short, and it's written like a fairy tale. And in this fairy tale, he says, once upon a time, there was Vehicle 1, and Vehicle 1 did the following. And we'll talk about Vehicle 1 in a moment. Why the name Vehicles? He studied organisms. Why wasn't this book called Organisms? He chose the word vehicles because he didn't want to say organism, he didn't want to say human, he didn't want to say robot. He wanted to pick a word that would sort of cover all of them. I know for most of us, vehicle implies a car or some sort of technological thing, but Breitenberg vehicles, and we're going to look at a few of them in the rest of this lecture, they're meant to represent an organism, a human being, a machine, a robot, something that can move and push against the world and observe how the world pushes back. Okay, let's start with Vehicle 1. This is as simple as you can get. We have our little vehicle over here. It has a single wheel, so a very limited way to move about in its environment. And it has a sensor on the front of it, and this is a temperature sensor. So the warmer the temperature near that sensor, the stronger that sensor fires. And that sensor sends a signal along a wire which connects the sensor to the motor. That's it. Not too complicated. Okay. If we take that vehicle and you saw that vehicle swimming around in a pond, so already you don't tend to see vehicles swimming in a pond, so there's a biological metaphor here. You'd probably say it's restless and does not like warm water, but it's quite stupid since it's not able to turn back to the nice cold spot that it overshot in its restlessness. However, you'd probably say it's alive since you've never seen a particle of dead matter that moves around quite like this. Okay. It doesn't like warm water. Why would you conclude that?
Because it moves quickly out of it.
It moves quickly whenever it's in warm water, right? It hates warm water and slows down when it's in cold. Why would a self-respecting scientist write like this? Does Vehicle 1 actually dislike warm water?
Maybe warm water energizes it.
Maybe.
Like, you don't
We know exactly what warm water does to this machine. It makes this sensor fire more strongly, which sends a stronger signal back to the wheel, which means the wheel spins faster, right? So the stronger the sensor fires, the faster the wheel turns. The more heat, the more sensation, the more wheel turning, the faster it goes, and vice versa. Right?
Wait, is it like the fact that that robot doesn't have a brain yet, it can sort of act like something that is alive?
Okay.
That might be thinking.
Possibly. So you mentioned this robot doesn't have a brain, right? It has a brain. It's not much of a brain. There's one wire. That's it. Now, whether that's a brain or not, I don't know, but it's pretty simple. But yes, maybe for shorthand, it doesn't have a brain, yet it starts to exhibit behavior that kind of looks lifelike, right? It's still pretty simple, but you don't usually see dead matter that moves about like this. Okay. We probably wouldn't say that it's alive and doesn't like warm water because we know what's going on inside the robot. There's one sensor attached to one motor with one wire, right? However, if you go and look at an actual pond, you see things that are moving around in more or less this way. And usually we don't know, or the casual observer doesn't know what's going on inside. And you probably say, yeah, that's alive. That's an organism, whatever it is. It's not a speck of dirt in the pond. Okay. Seems kind of odd language for a scientist to be using. Let's move on and talk about vehicle 2. Some of you have taken my evolutionary robotics class. So you've already seen some of this. If you know the answer, don't spoil it for the rest of your fellow students. Okay, let's look at vehicle 2A. As you can see, vehicle 2A is a little more complex than vehicle 1, but not by a lot. Vehicle 2A has 2 wheels at the back, and it's got 2 sensors on the front. Now they're not temperature sensors, they're light sensors. The left front sensor is attached to the back left wheel, and the right front sensor is attached to the right front wheel. That's 2A. Let's say we give you a flashlight, and you turn on a flashlight front and to the right of the robot. What does the robot do?
Do they turn towards the light?
Turn towards the light. How so?
Assuming that the light isn't perfectly centered, one sensor will pick up a stronger signal than the other.
One sensor is going to pick up more light than the other. In this snapshot, in this moment in time, which sensor is picking up more light than the other? The right-hand one, right? The right-hand sensor is picking up more light because it's closer to the flashlight in this case, not by a lot. So the right sensor is firing more strongly than the left sensor. So what does that tell you about the wheels?
The right wheel is going to spin faster, so the robot's going to turn away.
It's actually going to turn away in this case, right? So the right wheel is going to spin faster than the left wheel, which means it's going to turn to the left. The moment that it turns a little bit to the left, the robot has pushed against the world, it's moved, the sensor values are going to change. How are the sensor values going to change? What's going to change at the next time step?
It's going to exaggerate that difference in sensor value.
Absolutely. So as it turns to the left, there's going to be a greater difference in the light levels to the left and the right, which means what's going to happen to the wheels? It's going to keep turning. A little more detail. It's going to turn faster because there's a greater difference between the sensors, which means there's a greater difference in the rate of spin of the 2 wheels. So it turns faster, right? So it's turning slowly and then turning faster and faster. What happens? Does it continue turning faster?
It'll stop when it's basically completely away from the light.
It's going to stop when it turns away from the light because as it's turning, obviously it's turning away from the light. If we assume that there's a bracket behind the 2 sensors, then maybe the light from the robot's point of view turns off and it stops moving. Or not. Whatever's going to happen, it maybe slows down or stops, facing away from the flashlight. You now chase after the flashlight from behind. What happens? It runs away. Vehicle 2A is the coward. It's afraid of light. Right? If you go after it with the flashlight, it will turn away quickly and slow down. I escape the light. You chase it and it'll speed up again and run away. Right? Okay. Let's look at 2B. And if you just look at the vehicle itself, there's only one difference between 2A and 2B, that we have these wires and we're now going to cross them. Left sensor attached to right wheel and vice versa. If we place a flashlight right here, front left, what is this vehicle going to do?
So first, it's going to see that the light difference is high, so it's going to turn the right wheel, right? Because it's the left light that's like right.
Correct. The left sensor is firing more strongly, so the right wheel is going to spin, And what's going to happen?
It's going to turn until it faces the light.
And
They're
then
going to be equal, so both the wheels are going to move. It's going to charge straight out.
it's going to turn towards the light, right? And at some point, both sensors are going to be equidistant from the light. And as you say, it's going to charge the light. It's going to move towards the light. And as it does, at the next time step, both sensors are firing more strongly than they did at the previous time step. So it's going to move even faster, faster and faster and faster. And if you approach this robot with a naked bulb, it'll smash that bulb to smithereens. This is the aggressor. It hates lights and will destroy them given the slightest opportunity to do so. The coward and the aggressor.
You could also call this the lover.
Possibly.
It really likes the light.
It really likes the light. Maybe likes the light a little bit too much, right? Maybe not a healthy relationship here, but yes, possibly, right? Okay. If you go and read this book, again, a very well-known scientist, very serious scientist, writing a book about vehicles in a fairy tale form and calling them the aggressor and the coward. Why? Why would you do such a thing?
Does he want to make us look at organisms as if they're robots, make them seem simpler?
Possibly. I mean, one of his points is basically this is a fruit fly, right? Forget the wheels and the lights, replace the wheels with wings, and replace the light sensors with chemosensors that can pick up particulate matter in the air, and you have a fruit fly, right? No matter how complex the odor plume is that's emanating off the rotten piece of fruit in the back corner, if we were to be able to image the amount of rotten fruit particulate matter in the air, it would be a very complex three-dimensional pattern. But we don't need differential calculus to swim upstream of the signal and find the apple or find the rotten fruit. We simply, as the fruit fly, turn towards where more of the particulate matter is at any given time. There may be a local eddy of particulate matter that might throw us off temporarily, but as we continue to do this, on average, we will swim upstream towards denser and denser smell of rotten fruit until we find the rotten fruit itself. Why are we talking about this in an HCI class? Because the emphasis on vehicles is not the inner complexity of the vehicle itself, but rather thinking carefully about its interaction with the world. So the complexity is out there in the world, this complex odor plume from the rotting fruit. If we think about the interaction appropriately, we can get away with very, very, very simple machines. Biologists, often, not all of them, but when they're looking at the organism, they build up an overly complex mental model of how that organism is able to do what it does. They focus on the internal neural complexity of the organism rather than thinking about the way in which the organism interacts with its world. And the focus in HCI is always thinking about not the technology itself, but trying to think carefully about the interaction between two things, technology and the human participant. In this case, for the moment, we're still thinking about the technology, the vehicle, and how it interacts with a physical environment. Okay. Let's keep going. Let's do a couple more. Let's move on to vehicle series 3. This is vehicle 3A, which is the same as vehicle 2A, except now we have minus signs next to the wires. What do you think the minus signs mean rather than plus?
The stronger the signal, like the slower the wheels move.
Exactly. So this negative is shorthand for inhibitory connection. The sensor is trying to inhibit the wheel that it's attached to, and the stronger the sensor fires, the more power it has to inhibit the wheel. Biological nervous systems are a combination of excitatory and inhibitory connections between neurons. So plus and minus. Plus is going to be excitatory. The more this thing fires, the more this thing turns or fires. Inhibitory, the more this thing fires, the more suppressed, the slower or less this thing fires. Okay. I've switched things around here. In this case, we have vehicle 3A turning. I'm showing you how it turns. I'm not showing you where the light is. Where do you think the light is in this case?
If the light is at the top left, then the closer sensor would be have a higher output, which means the left motor will have a lower output.
That's it.
So that it will turn towards the light that is on.
Exactly. So if the light is where the cursor is here, there's more light falling on the left sensor than the right sensor, which means the left wheel is more inhibited than the right wheel, which means the left wheel turns slower than the right wheel, and it will turn towards the light. And as the coward turns more towards the light, there's more light falling on both sensors, which means there's more inhibition of the wheels, and the robot slows and eventually comes to a stop. If you were then to suddenly snatch away the flashlight, what would happen?
Speed up.
It would speed up, and then you put it somewhere else. It'll turn towards it, kind of go towards it a little bit, and slow and stop. This is actually the lever, right? The system with uncrossed connections will in this case come to rest as it turns directly towards the source, because the source is to one side. The motor near the side of the source will slow down more than the motor on the far side. In Bradensburg's word, this vehicle loves the light source in a permanent way, staying close by in quiet admiration from the time it spots the light to all future time. Okay. Maybe also, again, maybe not a healthy relationship, but okay. Does this vehicle love the light?
No.
Does the aggressor hate the light? Of course not, right? This is ridiculous. Why would he be using this very charged language? Clearly this thing doesn't love the light, or doesn't hate the light or love the light. That's ridiculous, right? We love things and hate things. We're different. We are not vehicles, right? Right?
How can we differentiate between, so if you program the robot, right, to destroy a light, can that translate though to hatred?
I don't know. You tell me. You just told me that this thing cannot hate, but we do, right? So we must therefore be different from the vehicles. It has to be true. If these things cannot hate, and we do, what's the difference? What distinguishes you from a vehicle?
Simplicity.
Simplicity, okay. Maybe it's simplicity. Let's keep going. Vehicle 3C, again, not as complex as us. Still pretty simple. Yes, Margaret. Cannot change its mind. Okay, so you're raising the issue of determinism, right? The aggressor has no choice but to hate the light, and the lover has no choice but to, quote unquote, love the light, right? We're different. We choose. We make decisions. We have free will, right? We're different. Remember the Libet experiment? Be careful. We're on shaky ground again, right? Okay, we'll come back to determinism and choice in a moment. Let's focus on complexity. We are way more complicated than vehicles, so that's the difference. All right. Again, this one still pretty simple. We have 6 sensors arrayed along the front of the robot. And like before, we have 3 pairs, light, temperature, and oxygen. We have 1 light front left, 1 light front right, temperature front left, temperature front right, and so on. Same setup as before, just 3 of them, okay? We have the 2 wheels back there. The 2 light sensors are crossed and excitatory, so the wires come across and they have pluses attached to them. Temperature are uncrossed excitatory connections. Oxygen, uncrossed inhibitory connections, straight down with negative signs. And organic material, I'm sorry, there's 4 pairs. Organic material, so back to the fruit fly. How much or how little particulate matter is there in the air? Organic particulate matter in the air, crossed inhibitory connections. If you now look at the back left wheel, you'll notice that there are 4 wires arriving there, which are giving information about the amount of oxygen, temperature, light, and organic matter on one side of the robot or the other. We have those 4 wires, so you can assume that there's 4 numbers that are coming down the wires, and we're just going to take those 4 numbers, add them together, take the average of those 4 numbers, and that single number, that average, is the speed of the wheel. So far, so good? I've given you all the information you possibly need to understand what this thing does. If we put a light source on the left side of the robot and a heat source on the right side of the robot, sorry, a light source on the left side of the robot and a heat source on the right side of the robot, what does this machine do? Forget oxygen and organic material.
They're on the same side.
Different sides. Light left, light source left, heat source right.
It's going to turn towards light.
I don't know, you may be right. Light source left, heat source right, oxygen emitter on the right. There's a house plant sitting on the right side of the robot. Now what does it do? I haven't told you how much oxygen the plant gives off, so it's kind of hard to say.
What's organic material?
Organic material, you've got a piece of rotting fruit in the back of the room, and it's gradually giving off very small pieces of fruit that are so small they just are suspended in the air to the point where they just float around the room, and if you're a fruit fly, you can smell it from a couple meters away. What's the point Bratenberg is trying to make with vehicle 3C here?
You can make a vehicle so complicated you couldn't just say what it would do.
You can make a robot so complicated that it's hard to say what it does. This robot isn't even that complicated, right? Compared to us, it's already almost impossible to predict, even if I give you all the information, what it's going to do. If I give you a computer program, you could probably simulate this thing and start to figure it out. That's the forward problem. Here's the wiring diagram. Tell me what this robot does. What about the backward problem? I hide the wiring from you. I show you vehicles 3C, and I put houseplants and light sources and heat sources and pieces of rotting fruit in different positions relative to the robot, and it goes towards the fruit and away from the plant and towards the oxygen and then away from the oxygen, and then very hard to say what's the wiring diagram inside. Right? This is part of the reason why biologists have such a hard time. Right? It's very, very tricky to work out from wiring behavior and vice versa. Does this robot love and hate? Of course not, right? Why not? It's only got, how many wires there? 6 sensors, so 12 wires. You have 10 to the 14 wires, or synapses. It's a lot of synapses. Not yet, but we're getting close to being able to create a GPU cluster that we could put inside a wheeled vehicle that does have 10 to the 14 wires inside it. Today, in 2018, we could probably build a Bratenberg vehicle that starts to approach the number of synapses in the human brain. We're not quite there yet, but we're getting close. Could that hypothetical vehicle love and hate? It would demolish the argument that we can love and hate because we have more wires than the vehicle. It's got the same number of wires we do.
It's just our own mental model of the complexity of it. So, like, if we can't understand it, we'll probably assume it has more human-like qualities to it.
We have a bias when we create mental models to make overly complicated mental models. We often assume there's more going on under the hood than there actually is. And you can see that if you play around with vehicles for a while. As you read the vehicles book, or at least for most of us, you get an increasingly uneasy feeling as you move through these vehicles, because any argument you could make about what separates us from vehicles tends to fall apart. Right? So the complexity one, back in 1980 when he wrote this book, it was still a distant dream, but today in 2018, you better not be relying on the argument that we love and hate because we have many more wires. That's not going to be true for much longer. There was a mention of determinism, right? The robot can't choose. I forget which vehicle it is, but there is a vehicle beyond vehicle 3 that chooses things. Now you know what's going on inside, so you can say it's still deterministically choosing to do this at this point in time. We don't do that. We don't do it deterministically. We freely choose one thing over another. But that's when Libet steps in and says, careful. I'm not trying to disabuse you of your notion that you're better than a Bradenberg vehicle, but it's interesting to try and formulate a distinction between the two. A hard thing to do. All right. That's taken us way too far into philosophy for this course. We're going to back out now. The main point for our purposes that I'd like you to take away from the lesson of the Bradenberg vehicles is that if you think about interactions carefully, you can often come up with a relatively simple machine that does something relatively useful. Okay. So where does this problem come from of attributing overly complex mental models to these vehicles? It depends on our perspective. So if we take a behavioral perspective, which is the cartoon I showed you at the beginning here, we're watching the robot from a distance. If we watch from a distance, we don't really know what's going on inside the vehicle or the organism or the robot. We often attribute a complex mental model to it. If we can understand what's going on inside, we're able to understand these wires, and if I gave you half an hour, you probably could start to predict vehicle 3C here, the knower. It sort of is a tonic against our bias to make complex mental models. We start to make a much more simpler mental model of what this robot is actually doing. And if we do that over and over again as HCI designers, we might be able to start to design this kind of interactive technology that's simple and does interesting things if placed in a rich environment. Okay. I want to skip over this because we have 8 minutes left. I want to finish with the class exercise. So in a moment, you're going to turn to your neighbor. You're going to spend a few minutes trying to sketch out a robot swarm that's composed of a bunch of Bradenberg vehicles. Okay. So each robot in the swarm has 3 pairs of sensors, 2 light sensors, 2 heat sensors, and 2 sound sensors, one on each side of the robot's body. We're going to scatter over the robot also has a gripper, and inside the pincer of the gripper are 2 touch sensors. So if it grabs something, those 2 touch sensors fire. We're then going to make a rich environment, a relatively rich environment. We're going to strew over a large area a bunch of objects with lights attached to them. So there's our flashlights. And we're going to place 1 heat source in the environment, and we want the robots to collect all the light sources and bring them to the heat source. If you want, you can think about this as a prototyping exercise for robot rovers on Mars. We're going to distribute some material on the surface of Mars with 1 mission, and the next mission we're going to send a robot swarm, and they're going to bring everything together and start to assemble a base for eventual human occupation. This is sort of version 0.0001 of that scenario. Okay. Also, robots probably shouldn't knock into one another because if they break themselves on Mars, as far as we know, there's nobody there to fix them. Okay. You can make relatively complex robots by creating a whole bunch of nested if-then-else statements, and inside each of them is a Bradenberg vehicle. So if, for example, the gripper touch sensors are firing, the robot is holding something. As long as the robot is holding something, then we want the robot to go towards the heat source. More heat on the left, turn the right wheel towards the left-hand heat source. If there's more heat on the right, spin the left wheel towards it, right? There may then be another statement down here. If the heat sensor is above some threshold, execute a different Bradenberg vehicle. So each element in the swarm at any one time is going to be a single Bradenberg vehicle, but depending on sensation, it can switch to be different Bradenberg vehicles. Make sense? We got 7 minutes left, so take 3 or 4 minutes, turn to your neighbor, take this and see if you can sketch out some more parts of this if-then-else statement that will implement the desired behavior. Good luck.
Making battle bots.
Yeah, we can probably do that. The first step is
Yes. They can hear each other. Oh. So if the light source is not very strong, we can click.
So how do we get this so it doesn't?
And then once it's worked, it'll just drop light source.
Then
You get rare to pick up.
So if it has the same sensor for X amount of time, will slow down.
Are you worried that they're all
Put a
going
timer on it. If you maintain the same level of light, that's what
Yeah,
like in the range for X amount of time, it'll like slow down until like it grips, and once it grips, it'll reset the timer. But then the light's still there. The light's in the room. Oh, you gotta remember fire.
so if light sensor like
I know. They're like crabs. Look like flex.
So I would say,
No, because they would.
I mean, you could probably have some type of bell curve for light. So it's just like, speeds up until grab it.
They would
I would say a time.
buy it for body.
Well, you could make a function of time and just do that sense if the time of the sensors. So every 30 minutes.
You wouldn't make it as a like robot.
I didn't have to decide what it was for. But if it hits it, it's actually breaking. It's gonna be fast.
Yeah, but
It'd be like,
if you can like noise. You can also make a picture.
coordinates.
I think it's perfect.
So you use the heat sensor for the light as well, because light produces heat as well. So you can have it so like the light sensor and the heat sensor. Yes,
Yeah, but then the robots will reach it. Yeah.
no, I think that's fair, but definitely yes. They don't have something aspect.
I think what it would just end up being is robots like
Well, the thing is, I was saying if it had a LED source and then once you close enough as a heat source, that's actually
and it's really doing all these
yeah, that's the only thing. Like, this like
having to use the sound sensors, scratching. It's great. It's like, oh shit, that's I mean, there's just more questions I have. Like, you can use my
Okay, we got 2 minutes left. You've all designed a swarm for NASA, right?
Yeah.
Make sure you go and get intellectual property rights on your idea before they steal it. Let's just talk very briefly about how to approach this problem, and then when we start again on Tuesday, we'll talk about some of your potential solutions. Here we need to think very carefully about physical context, right? So these robots are moving around on a particular surface. What are some aspects of the physical context here that matter that aren't explicitly in the set of requirements? You can treat this little cartoon here as a very brief set of requirements.
What about the fact that sound is different on different planets in space?
I mentioned Mars on purpose, right? So does sound carry in Mars? A little bit. There's a very thin atmosphere, not very well. Well, let's assume, to make our lives a little bit simpler, that sound carries.
The lights probably can't be repeatedly smashed against the ground to make more noise.
Possibly. Lights can't be smashed against the ground. Possibly.
The topographics of where we're doing this.
Ah.
So if you're in a valley, there's no chance you can see light source that's on.
Okay, now you're thinking like an HCI designer, right? Can these robots see each other or see the light sources from wherever they are in this environment? Does line of sight matter? What else? What are some other aspects like that that may matter for this problem?
We need to know if when a robot rips an object, does it cover the light? Or is the
Ah.
light still visible?
Absolutely. We talked about occlusion, right? Some of you I can't see very well at the back of the room. What happens when a robot grasps the object? It's not clear here. Let's pause there. I want you to think about that some more, and then on Tuesday we'll talk about some of your potential solutions to this problem. You have a quiz due tonight. Come and see Tom Lee at 5 p.m. at the Ira Allen Chapel tonight. If you do, there's an extra 3% of your final grade in it for you.
It's at 5. How long does it go to?
It's going to be exactly an hour and then 15 minutes Q&A. 6:15.
Okay, yeah, I start class exactly 6:15.
Okay.
Skip class. Does QA start at 6:15?
Starts at 6.
Okay, and it ends at 6.
So I'm going to have a sign-in sheet which you can sign after the Q&A, but it sounds like you're going to have to run to class.
That's fine.
You can also do it on the honor system. As long as you're there, you can sign it.
It will show my face. Okay.
For overall, I will take that, if you come, I'll take that 3%, and wherever you're missing 3%, I will put it in. So if you got 4 out of 5 on an assignment, that 1% there to make 5 out of 5, with 1% somewhere else. So basically, whatever your final grade is going to be, this will add 3% to it. Hi there. Where is it? It's also, I talk about it at the beginning of class, and it's in the video also. But 5 p.m. at Ira Allen Chapel tonight.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.